If good artists borrow and great artists steal, who exactly are the directors of today stealing from? We're tracing the cinematic roots of film's family tree with our picks for the top 10 most influential directors of all time. Kicking us off at number 10, we want to honor the filmmakers who've influenced the future of cinema by literally inventing it. And the first filmmaker that comes to mind is James Cameron, a man who's often more engineer than filmmaker, whose reckless pursuit of technological innovation has brought us advances in 3D, CGI, underwater filmmaking, and accidentally scuba diving. There's also Georges Méliès, the father of special effects. But if we're going to kick off our list with some of the grandfathers of cinema, it's got to be the Lumiere brothers.
Just the thought of it that one is doing for Lumiere brothers with 100 years ago, we are still enjoying it and doing it. That means they are immortal.
Auguste and Louis Lumiere are credited as the first ever filmmakers, which sort of makes them influential by default. But they deserve credit for more than just being the first to the party. They also invented the camera, the projector, and popularized their new tech all over Europe, effectively infecting the world with the cinema bug. And while they couldn't quite crack narrative film in the way we know it today, they managed to stumble on rudimentary forms of the documentary and comedy. There's no denying that Hollywood and the mainstream movie industry has a color problem. Namely, there's not enough of it. So for our number 9 pick, we want to give credit to some of the filmmakers who have helped diversify the director's chair. And we can't not mention directors like Van Peebles and Gordon Parks, who picked up the camera amidst extreme prejudice and friction. Tyler Perry, who proved that movies made for black people could be just as commercially viable as those for suburban tweens. Or true inspirations like Oscar Micheaux, who clocks in as the first black filmmaker ever, getting his start in the 19-teens. But for our pick, we don't think anyone's done as much to bring the minority into the spotlight as the one and only Spike Lee.
I never said that I had any answers, and I don't think that it's fair to criticize me for that. Say, well, I didn't like Do the Right Thing because Spike doesn't have an answer for the racial situation here in this country. I mean, that's not my job, really.
Lee has pointed his lens directly into the crossfire of hatred and intolerance ever since Do the Right Thing. When working at his best, he's managed to find both the humanity and the hypocrisy in every side of racial conflict. He's revolutionary for showing America that you can cast black people as more than pimps, drug dealers, and prostitutes, which is a terribly sad thing to call revolutionary, but it's done a hell of a lot for minority representation in film, so we'll take it. Moving forward for our next pick, who do we think for the big summer blockbusters and massive franchise bonanzas that litter our marquees with sequel numbers and our toy stores with official action figures today? Well, it's probably our number 8, Steven Spielberg.
My name is Steve Spielberg, and I just directed a movie called Jaws.
Sure, you can make a pretty compelling case for his contemporaries like George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola, but Spielberg's Jaws created the modern event film. Prior to Jaws, summer was a veritable dumping ground of whatever slop movie studios wanted to phone in from home. But with a little bit of TV advertising, a pinch of luck, Jaws showed the world that summer releases could be rainmakers worth structuring an entire year's slate around. Since then, his deft balance of thrill, pathos, humor, humanity, and Tom Hanks has proved him to be one of the most consistently profitable, critically acclaimed, and recognizable filmmakers of the modern era. Now, of course, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and company didn't do it on their own. They drew from a massive well of international influence. And if we're talking about inspirational directors from abroad, we've got to mention the likes of Fellini, Bergman, Lang, and Renoir. But for our number 7 pick, we think that Akira Kurosawa has done a hell of a lot for cinema these days.
Let me say it simply. I mean, Kurosawa was my master and so many others.
After the first one, the first one I saw was Seven Samurai, and after that I was completely hooked.
Check out our Film School pilot on Star Wars and Samurai if you want a full Webby Award-winning breakdown. That's right, we're bragging. But the basics of it are this. Akira Kurosawa took traditional Japanese filmmaking roots, combined them with a childhood fondness for American westerns, and created something that was both universally accessible and cinematically groundbreaking, catapulting Japan into the international film spotlight in the process. At number 6, we've got an early European director who theorized his way into novel territory. And it's not Murnau, although FW was an absolute legend. Instead, we've got to hand this spot to one of the Soviet montage theorists who practically turned editing on its head. And it could have been Kuleshov or Pudovkin or Dziga Vertov, but we all know that not one of them quite lives up to the big cheese, Sergei Eisenstein.
Eisenstein is known, of course, not just as a practical filmmaker, but a great theoretician. So I believe, Akira's where he was the ultimate father figure of world cinema.
Eisenstein looked at his predecessors, looked at all the innovations in cinema thus far, and realized they came from the creative juxtaposition of two shots to create a meaning that was greater than the sum of its parts. He then went on to come up with half a dozen more brilliant ways to do this, and then showed them all off in Strike, October, and especially Battleship Potemkin. His work unchained cinema from the restrictions of continuity and reality and allowed all future directors to fracture time, space, and narrative in ways that were previously unheard of. Next up at number 5, we want to think a little more independent. While most influential by its very nature tends to favor those directors who have contributed mostly to mainstream cinema, we think there are some other filmmakers worth honoring who have broken the mold for the indie world. Lately, we're pretty proud of Tarantino and Soderbergh for bringing an indie sensibility to a wide release of screens. We have the utmost respect for Buñuel, Fellini, and Antonioni for pushing their respective envelopes, and we absolutely adore the reckless abandon with which Cassavetes shunned convention. But we think the real hero of the avant-garde is none other than Jean-Luc Godard.
Moi, je crois pas du reste que le cinéma influence la jeunesse. Ce qu'il faut essayer, c'est que ça soit plutôt la jeunesse qui influence le cinéma.
Busting onto the feature scene with Breathless, one of the boldest and most enduring statements on cinematic rule-breaking you'll ever find in every single film school class ever, he gave us jump cuts, long takes, direct address, and carte blanche to break any rule, no matter how sacrosanct. Over the entire course of film history, there have been a rare few directors who have managed to achieve something so unparalleled, so close to perfection that they stand relatively alone as cinematic virtuosos. One of those names, the name you're going to be very angry isn't quite our number 4 pick, is Stanley Kubrick. But another one of the names, and our pick for number 4, just barely edging out Stanley, is Alfred Hitchcock.
Life is a big mystery, isn't it? It always has been. I think people are intrigued by mystery.
There is perhaps no other director who so deeply understood his audience and so adeptly manipulated them. There has been no other filmmaker who has so completely gripped his viewers by both their intellects and their emotion all at once. Often imitated but never replicated, Hitchcock has taught everyone from film neophytes to Francois Truffaut the intricacies of psychological storytelling and stands as perhaps the pinnacle of film excellence. But perfection isn't everything. Hitchcock built his masterpieces on a deep foundation of film history.
So we're all handing influences down and inspiring from generation to generation.
Almost every director today owes a debt to at least one of the forefathers like Howard Hawks, Cecil B. DeMille, Billy Wilder, John Huston, and Ernst Lubitsch. However, if there's one thing that every working filmmaker has in common, it's that in one way or another they stand on the back of our number 3 pick, Orson Welles.
Where did you get the confidence from to make a film with such...
Ignorance, sheer ignorance, there's no confidence to equal it.
There is perhaps no other single film that advanced cinema more than Citizen Kane. One need only look at the dramatic shift in films produced before and after its 1941 release to see how important Welles truly was.
It was kind of, in a wonderful way, responsible for American filmmaking emerging as an important world product.
Deep focus cinematography, varied camera heights, dramatic lighting, and nonlinear navigation through time may be the big reasons we hail the film, but he actually didn't really invent any of it. Think of Orson Welles as a magnificent thief, a brilliant synthesizer, a man who delved into the annals of filmmaking, brought forth his favorite bits, and with them built a more meaningful whole than had ever previously been assembled. So who does Welles have to thank? Well, there's no one whose influence was stronger than John Ford.
Back in the 60s, Orson Welles was interviewed, and one of the questions he was asked was who his favorite American directors were. He said, well, I prefer the old masters, by which I mean John Ford, and John Ford.
Welles studied Ford's Stagecoach every night over dinner in preparation for directing Citizen Kane. And if Ford influenced Welles and Welles influenced everyone else, well, then by the transitive property of influence, Ford gets a spot on our list.
Mr. Ford, you made a picture called Three Bad Men, which was a large-scale Western, and you had a quite elaborate land rush in it. How did you shoot that?
With a camera.
Now, to suggest that John Ford's only achievement was Orson Welles' abject fandom is severely underestimating his importance. And although his vision of the American frontier is perhaps the definitive cinematic version of our national identity, his success extended far beyond the Western. In one year, he directed Young Mr. Lincoln, The Grapes of Wrath, and Stagecoach. His work was simple but still nuanced, massive but still intimate, and political but still personal, which makes him truly one of the greatest cinematic inspirations of all time. And finally, closing in at number 1, where would any of these directors be if it weren't for the earliest innovations of film's pioneers? It's easy to forget that cinema isn't even 150 years old. However, dedicated filmmakers pushed the genre from unchanging static long shots to today in an astonishingly short amount of time. So in considering some of the earliest innovators, we have to thank Robert W. Paul for inventing the first ever cut on continuity, George Albert Smith for the first close-up and POV shot, and James Williamson for the first ever reverse angle. Edwin S. Porter gets a massive shout out for the first filmmaker to intercut, but for our number 1 pick, we have to give it to D.W. Griffith, the director who put all these fresh ideas together and figured out how they could work in concert to tell a feature-length story.
His career was both an inspiration and a cautionary tale. His best films will always rank among the most important films ever made.
If all earlier directors were cavemen coming up with words like me and rock, throw, and even putting them together in elementary ways like me, rock, throw, Griffith basically came along and invented grammar. He showed us how to arrange shots into coherent scenes, link scenes to make coherent sequences, and combine sequences to build complex meaning. His work is the pivot point from cinema as a technological curiosity and peep show attraction to legitimate way to tell complicated stories. And that may sound all fine and well today, where cinema as storytelling is as natural as speech, but coming up with that in a vacuum? Incredible. So, what do you think? Do you disagree with some of our picks? Did we leave out your favorite director? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more Cinefix movie lists.